Welcome to Histrology, where history meets royalty.
She wrote as if the ink itself resisted the truth. Somewhere in the cold stone belly of the conciergerie, Marie Antoinette pressed her trembling fingers to a page that would never be seen by the world, at least not in her lifetime. The candle beside her hissed like something alive, burning low, fighting the same slow suffocation she felt in her chest. She was no longer the glittering Dauphine of France, no longer the queen adorned in jewels and excess. Here, she was merely prisoner number 280, a woman crushed by the weight of a collapsing world. Her diary, hidden beneath straw and coarse blankets, was not a confession, it was a reckoning. The cell stank of damp walls, iron locks, and the kind of rot that came from human despair. Yet she wrote anyway, her words carrying the scent of fading lavender from the life she once lived. The revolution had taken everything, but the memories she inked stubbornly defied erasure. She began her entries not with dates, because time had dissolved inside the prison. She marked them instead by sensations, the tremble of cannons in the distance, the tightening of the guards' moods, the echoing cries of the condemned. The moment she could no longer hear her children's voices in her dreams. "I hear footsteps," she scratched into the paper, "but I can no longer tell if they are real or the ghosts of all I have lost." Her decline was slow, yet painfully precise. Days blended into each other. Shadows crawled along the walls like silent witnesses, and every hour reminded her of the life she had lived in impossible splendor. She remembered the polished marble floors of Versailles, so cold yet so clean they reflected her like a mirror. She remembered the clatter of courtiers' heels, the rustle of silk skirts, the perfume-heavy air designed to mask the odor of a monarchy decaying from within. In those moments in prison, she realized that her downfall had not begun in the mob's roar or in the storming of the Bastille. It had begun much earlier. In the hollow rituals of a court that worshipped appearance over substance. She wrote about the silence that followed the death of her son, the weakening Dauphin. Louis Charles's laughter, she whispered across the page, still haunts the space between my ribs. They took him from me, and with him they stole the last piece of my heart. Each sentence felt like a wound reopening. She described the precise way her hands shook when she touched the memory of her children, how her nails dug into her palms from the effort not to scream in grief. If the world knew the coldness with which they separated us, if they knew how his small hands reached for me, the sentence trailed off, unfinished, because even memory had become unbearable. Another entry unfolded almost like a letter. "To my husband," she wrote, not daring to use his name. "You were a gentleman drowning in a world too loud, too ruthless for your soul." She described how Louis Xv's eyes changed in the final months, how fear hollowed them, how uncertainty carved lines into his face. She had never loved him with the romance that poets described, but she had grown to care for him with a loyalty forged by shared suffering. "We were children made into monarchs," she admitted, "and the crown fit neither of us." Even in prison, she still heard the echo of the guillotine that had already claimed him. She had not witnessed his execution, but she had felt it, felt the moment the wind changed, felt the silent gasp of the palace walls in her memory. She wrote of the night the news reached her, how she pressed her knuckles to her teeth so hard she tasted blood. "I could not cry," she wrote. "The guards would have taken my tears as weakness. I had no right to appear human, and so she became stone." Until the ink softened her again, the entries turned darker, heavier, describing the trial that mocked her existence. She wrote of the courtroom, its air thick with hatred, its judges hungry not for justice but for spectacle. "They looked at me as if I were already dead," she scribbled. "They did not want truth. They wanted a villain shaped from the remnants of a dying monarchy." She recorded the insults thrown at her, the accusations crafted from fantasies and fears. "The most painful words," she wrote slowly, "they accused me of being a monster to my own child." It was the one moment the entire court saw her break. She wrote, "I felt the weight of the world crush me, not for myself, but for my son, whose innocence they used as a weapon. I spoke for him, for motherhood itself, and for a heartbeat they saw not a queen but a woman, but the fleeting humanity vanished as quickly as it appeared." The verdict had been decided long before she walked into the chamber. Her diary captured the night after the trial as a slow unraveling. "I dreamed of a garden," she wrote, "one I have not seen since childhood. Lilacs, warm wind, sunlight through leaves. I walked toward my children, but they faded like smoke." She described waking in a sweat, the stone beneath her cheek colder than death. She wrote about the guard who peered into her cell as if checking whether she still breathed, and how she wished he would stop, how she would rather be forgotten entirely than be watched as she decayed. She chronicled small humiliations with painful clarity: the threadbare gown she was forced to wear, the stale bread that scraped her throat, the bucket in the corner that stripped the last of her dignity. Yet she also recorded small rebellions. The way she sat straight even when her spine ached. The way she braided her hair with trembling fingers, refusing to let despair claim her appearance. The way she whispered to herself in Austrian to remember who she had been before France devoured her. "I am still Marie," she wrote, "even if the world wishes to erase me." But darkness crept into her words as the days shortened. She began writing more frequently, almost obsessively, as if she feared forgetting the sound of her own voice inside her mind. She wrote about the whispers she heard from other prisoners, about the damp seeping into her bones, about the phantom ache in her heart when she imagined her daughter growing up without her. She wrote about time collapsing, how days felt like centuries yet weeks vanished in a blink, and then the entries shifted, they became calmer. "Too calm. I feel a strange peace," she wrote. "Perhaps acceptance, perhaps exhaustion. The fear that once clawed at my ribs has grown quiet, not because I am brave, but because I have nothing left to lose." She described how her hands had stopped shaking, how the shadow of the guillotine no longer terrified her. "What is death?" she wrote, "to a woman who has already lost her world?" She detailed her conversations with the guards, the rare ones who softened upon seeing her weakened state. One offered her water without disdain. Another allowed her a moment in the courtyard to feel the cold October air. "For a moment," she wrote, "I felt the sky, not its warmth, but its immensity. I had forgotten what it meant to breathe under open air." The writing deepened further, her reflections turning philosophical. She questioned fate, monarchy, revolution, and the cruelty of history. "Had I been born a baker's daughter," she asked, "would the world have been kinder? Or does suffering find us no matter where we stand?" She wrote of the illusions of power, how crowns only hid the fragility of those who wore them. "A queen is not a woman," she noted. "She is a symbol, one that can be worshipped or destroyed at will." The candle wax dripped like tears across the pages. Her script grew more precise, more elegant, as if this diary were her last attempt to maintain her identity. Yet beneath the grace was resignation and understanding that these words might remain buried forever. The final entries of Part 1 transitioned into her physical decline. She described pain in her chest, weakness in her legs, the dizziness that washed over her when she tried to stand. She wrote of her hair falling out in strands, of her cheeks hollowing, of the tremors that no longer came from fear but from starvation. "My reflection in the water bucket," she wrote, "is not a queen, not even a woman I recognize. I have become a ghost haunting my own life." She ended one entry with a line that lingered in the cold air long after the ink dried. "History will judge me, but I hope someone someday will read these words and understand the truth behind the crown." She no longer knew how many days had dissolved since her last entry, but she felt the change in the air. The stone walls, once merely cold, now seemed to pulse with a deeper chill, as if winter itself had descended early inside her cell. Marie's breath came in faint clouds, each exhale a reminder of the fragile thread that tied her to the living world. The diary lay open before her, its pages crinkled by damp, edges darkened by constant handling. She pressed her fingertips to the rough paper, grounding herself in the only connection she still had to her identity. Her wrists ached under the weight of fatigue, yet she forced herself to write, not because she believed her words would survive, but because writing had become a fragile defiance, the only way left for her to assert her existence. Prison had stripped her of jewels, gowns, servants, dignity, even her name. But the ink recognized her. In the soft scratch of the quill, she felt something like humanity return for a moment. "I dream often," she wrote, "but not of rescue. I dream of silence." The dreams were no longer vivid memories of Versailles or the laughter of her children. Instead, they were fragmented visions, a corridor disappearing into darkness, a faceless figure holding her hand, a crown melting like wax in the sun. She dreamed of the guillotine, not with fear, but with eerie clarity, the polished wood, the rope heavy with sweat, the blade whispering above her like a metallic sigh. She dreamed of walking barefoot across the gardens she once ruled, petals turning to ash beneath her steps. "I wake from these dreams without panic," she admitted in the diary. Perhaps this is what it means to surrender. In these pages, she allowed herself to speak truths she had buried for years. She confessed to loneliness in Versailles, to the suffocating scrutiny of court life, to the cruel expectations wrapped in silk and etiquette. She wrote about the night she danced for hours, pretending joy while her heart ached with the weight of an empire's resentment. She wrote of the whispers that followed her everywhere: foreigner, Austrian, spendthrift, which each word slicing at her like invisible knives. "How easily a crown becomes a noose," she penned. Yet she wrote not only of sorrow. She wrote of moments she clung to, her daughter's first steps, the rare evenings when Louis smiled without restraint, the quiet mornings in Petit Trianon when she slipped away from the court and walked barefoot through the dew-covered grass. "I loved simplicity," she wrote, perhaps too late. Her recollections grew heavier as she turned to the day Louis was taken away, the day the monarchy died before their deaths were formalized. She described the deafening roar of the crowds outside, their hatred so thick it felt like a storm pressing against a stone. She remembered his trembling hands, the cold kiss he placed on her forehead, the way he whispered, "Courage." It was the last time she felt warmth that was not from a candle. "His courage became my burden," she wrote slowly. "The world demanded it from me long after I had none left to give." Her entries grew more desperate as she detailed the nights she could hear executions from her cell. The guillotine's blade did not make a loud sound, but the reaction of the crowd carried like thunder gasps, cheers, a silence so profound it felt like a void opening in the earth. Each time, Marie felt her heart tighten, wondering if she knew the condemned. Sometimes she prayed it wasn't a friend. Other times she prayed it was not a child. But mostly, she prayed without purpose, the words falling flat against the stone ceiling. The guards grew harsher as the revolution deepened its madness. She documented every glare, every insult, every moment they treated her not as a human but as a trophy of the revolution. One guard kicked over her water bucket purely to watch her kneel. Another tugged at her hair to confirm she was not hiding anything. She endured it with a numbness that frightened her. "Pain becomes familiar," she wrote, like an unwelcome friend who never leaves. Her health worsened, yet she concealed the extent of her weakness from the guards. She described how her legs trembled when she stood, how her breaths shortened, how her fingers stiffened in the cold. She hid symptoms the way she once hid fears at court with a practiced grace. "I cannot give them the pleasure of seeing me break," she wrote. She wrote of hunger, to a hunger that gnawed not only at her stomach but at her spirit. Her rations were small, stale, barely edible. She sometimes let the bread crumble in her hands, holding the fragments as if remembering abundance might feed her. She wrote, "I feel my body shrinking, my bones rising beneath my skin like accusations." Yet in her diary, she did not hide from the guilt that shadowed her memory. She acknowledged the extravagance of Versailles, the disconnect between monarchy and reality, the blindness that had contributed to her downfall. "I was young," she wrote with aching honesty, "but youth is not an excuse. I lived in a palace of illusions. The people starved while we danced. Now I starve, and I understand." Another entry lingered on an unexpected moment, a single beam of morning light sneaking through the tiny barred window of her cell. She described the way it illuminated the dust in the air, turning the particles into golden flecks. "It reminded me of the Hall of Mirrors," she wrote. "But in Versailles, I never appreciated the light. Here, I treasure every ray." She spent an entire page writing about that sliver of sunlight. It became a symbol, a fragile hope she never admitted to anyone. "As long as the sun finds me," she wrote, "perhaps God still sees me." Her reflections turned inward, deeper, almost confessional. She questioned the nature of suffering, of power, of fate. She wrote of the fragility of legacy. "History," she mused, "is written by those who survive, not by those who perish. My truth may die with me." Then the tone shifted. She began writing directly to her daughter, Marie Tharcé, lines filled with sorrow, longing, advice. She told her to remain strong, to preserve dignity, to forgive when possible. "You are the last of us," she wrote. "Carry our name with courage, not regret." She wrote about her son again, but now the words were almost painful to read. She described the ache of remembering his small fingers wrapped around hers, the innocence in his eyes, the way revolutionaries exploited him. "If I could take his suffering upon myself," she wrote, "I would do so without hesitation." She begged history not to forget him. As the entries grew longer, the ink darker, Marie revealed a secret she had carried silently, moments of profound fear that she never showed even to her husband. She wrote about waking in the night with a scream she swallowed, terrified the court would interpret it as hysteria. She wrote of nights she walked the halls of Versailles feeling hunted by the pressure of expectations. "No crown is light," she wrote. "Even the most beautiful ones are forged in burden." Dread seeped into her words as she described the day they cut her hair. She remembered sitting rigid as the scissors scraped across her neck, the strands falling like pieces of her identity onto the floor. She did not cry. She wrote, "I felt as if I watched my former self die." Her diary became a map of emotional devastation. Some entries were long, poetic, weaving memories with reflections. Others were only a few words trembling across the page. "I feel cold. I hear them chanting. My heart is tired. I miss my children. I do not know how much longer I can pretend strength." Then came the entry that marked a shift the moment she realized her end was near. She wrote of the silence outside, the unusual calm in the corridors. She sensed a decision looming. "The walls feel different," she noted. "They listen now." Her thoughts spiraled into a new depth of introspection. She wrote, "A queen dies only once, but a woman dies many times." She wrote about the deaths she had already endured, the loss of her children, of her husband, of her home, of her identity. She questioned whether the final death would feel like release or betrayal. "I do not fear the blade," she confessed. "I fear being forgotten." Her suffering grew physical and undeniable. She detailed the shaking in her hands, the fever burning under her skin, the weakness that made lifting the quill an effort. But she forced herself to write more than ever. "The world may take my life," she wrote, "but it will not take my voice." Her tone changed again in the longest entry of Part 2, a hauntingly calm reflection in which she described watching dust fall from the ceiling and imagining it as snowfall. "If I pretend it is winter in Austria," she wrote, "I can almost feel my mother's arms around me." Near the end of Part 2, she wrote with a numb clarity, "I do not know what tomorrow brings, but tonight, I feel the end approaching like a quiet visitor." She closed with a sentence that trembled across the page. "If fate intends to take me soon, let it find me writing." The nights inside the conciergerie grew so thick with silence that Marie sometimes wondered if time itself had abandoned her. It was no longer measured by footsteps or the guards' torches or the faint clatter of chains. It was measured by her heartbeat, slow, frail, stubbornly continuing despite everything. The candle had burned down to half its size since her last long entry, but she guarded it like a relic. Without it, she feared she would dissolve entirely into the darkness. Her diary lay open, a lifeline splintering at the edges. She dipped the quill into the ink, her fingers trembling with the effort. The tremor was constant now, an unwelcome reminder that her body was breaking faster than her courage. "I write," she began, "because the darkness tries to swallow my thoughts before I can understand them." Her words drifted into a long reflection about memory. She no longer trusted her mind. Some memories felt sharp, fresh like the day she first stepped into Versailles. Others came to her clouded, as if viewed through heavy water. She sometimes forgot the exact sound of her daughter's voice and panicked, clutching the diary as if it might contain the memory she had misplaced. "I fear the loss of memory more than the loss of life," she wrote. "If I forget my children, then the world has succeeded in killing me before my execution." Her hands paused often. The ache shot through her wrists up to her elbows, but she persisted. The guards began to notice how she held the quill as if it were too heavy, how she leaned over the page as if her spine could no longer support her. They said nothing. They watched. She wrote of the strange calm that had settled over the prison. The usual arguments, the cries of the condemned, the drunken shouting of guards, everything felt muted. "There is a stillness here," she noted, as if every stone waits for an event it already knows is coming. Her dreams had changed too. No longer visions of gardens and children now, they were filled with corridors that led nowhere, doors she could not open, candles that would not light. She dreamed of a faceless woman who stood at the foot of her straw bed, watching her without speaking. Some nights she woke with a start, convinced the woman was still there, wrapped in the shadows of her cell.
"I wonder if she is death," as she wrote, "or merely my mind growing tired." She wrote about the guard who had softened unexpectedly over the last weeks. He never spoke kindly, not openly, but she noticed the slight adjustments. He placed the bread where she could reach it easily. He closed the cell door without slamming it. Once, he slid a small piece of cloth inside, perhaps intended as a rag, but soft enough for her to wipe her eyes discreetly. She wrote, "He is young. Perhaps he sees in me, not a queen, but a mother." But whatever kindness lingered in him was overshadowed by the harshness of the others. She documented each encounter meticulously. A bucket kick to spill her water, a mocking gesture, a laugh when she struggled to stand. One guard, intoxicated by cruelty, dragged his boot across her ankle deliberately, leaving a bruise that pulsed with heat for days. "I learned long ago that pain given without reason is the purest form of hatred," she wrote. Her entries grew slower, heavier, as if each sentence required her to drag her thoughts from the bottom of a deep well. She described the changes in her body, her nails turning brittle, her skin growing pale, the faint rattle in her chest that grew worse in the night. She wrote of fainting once, collapsing against the wall, waking to find her cheek pressed against the stone. "I thought," she wrote, "of that perhaps God intended to let me slip away quietly. But I woke again, which means even my death is not my own to choose." She began writing long reflections on fate, pages filled with questions that had tormented her since the beginning of the revolution. She questioned whether her arrival in France had been a blessing or a curse, whether she had ever truly been understood, whether monarchy was not doomed long before she took the throne. "I was a girl playing a role written centuries before I was born," she confessed. "When the world changed its script, I did not know how to follow." Her recollections of Versailles became sharper, almost painfully vivid. She wrote about the nights she paced the hall of mirrors alone. Her reflection multiplied endlessly, every version of her wearing the same expression of concealed exhaustion. She wrote about the elaborate gowns that now seemed absurd, oppressive, heavy fabrics stitched together to hide a woman who had never learned how to breathe freely. "I see my past self," she wrote, "and I want to reach through the glass and tell her to open her eyes." She described how she once laughed too loudly, danced too fearlessly, trusted too easily. "They hated me for my joy," she wrote, "and I did not notice until it was too late." Her reflections turned to Louis again. She remembered his gentle nature, his clumsy attempts to console her, his confusion at the world's cruelty. She wrote of the night he confessed he no longer understood his own country, his own people. He said, "I have lost France," and I did not know how to tell him that France had been slipping away from us both long before that night. The sorrow in her words deepened when she spoke of her son. She described how she sometimes imagined hearing him calling her, and how each time she whispered his name into the darkness, Guilt struck her like a blow. She feared forgetting the shape of his smile. She feared the world would erase him as easily as it had erased her status. "I write his name often," she wrote, "not for the diary, but for myself, to keep him alive in the only place the world cannot touch." Then came the entry that stretched for pages, long, wandering, filled with a depth of introspection that bordered on prophetic. She wrote about how suffering had reshaped her, carved her down to her essence. Without jewels, silk, or power, she was reduced to the woman she might have been had she been born in Austria as a commoner. "I wonder if I would have been kinder," she wrote. Wonder if I would have been happier. She questioned every decision, every moment that had brought her here. She wrote about responsibility, guilt, destiny, and the impossible weight of being a symbol rather than a human being. "We cannot apologize," she wrote. A woman can. And I am only a woman now." Her next entries grew shorter, fragmented, like thoughts scribbled in the pauses between waves of dizziness. "I cannot feel my feet. The candle is low, and the breath is tight. I hear voices outside. I am afraid they will come for me tonight, but they did not come." They did not come. Instead, the next morning brought something stranger. A stillness so complete it made her uneasy. The guards' faces were unreadable, their movements efficient and silent. She sensed it immediately. Something had changed. She wrote one sentence that filled an entire page. "The air tastes like farewell." Her mind drifted into memories of Austria, her childhood home, her mother's stern but protective presence, the familiar scent of pine. She wrote that she felt herself floating between past and present, unsure whether she still belonged to the living world. "I touched the stone beside me," she wrote, "to remind myself that I still exist." Her lungs ached with each breath. She pressed her hand to her chest often, feeling the uneven rhythm of her heartbeat. "My body grows louder as it fails," she wrote. "Every pulse feels like a drum counting down." Then she wrote something she had never dared to admit before. "I am ready, not eager, not resigned. Just ready, like a traveler who has packed the last of their belongings and waits quietly for dawn." She ended part 3 with a line that trembled even in ink. "If tomorrow is my last day, let me meet it with open eyes." The night before her execution was unlike any Marie had ever lived. It was not filled with terror, nor with screams echoing from distant cells. It was quiet, so unnaturally quiet that she felt as if the world itself had paused to watch her final moments. A stillness clung to the prison stones, heavy and expectant, like the hush before a storm breaks. She sat with her diary open, the candle flickering weakly. The flame trembled in the damp air, casting long shadows across the walls, shadows that seemed to reach toward her, asking her to finish what she began. Her hand shook as she dipped the quill into the ink. For the first time, she did not steady it. She let the tremor mark the page, let the weakness show. She no longer needed to hide her fragility. "On my final night," she wrote, I am strangely at peace." The words surprised even her, but they were true. She was tired beyond the exhaustion of hunger or illness. Tired of fighting a war she never understood, tired of carrying a crown she never asked for, tired of mourning a life that had slipped through her fingers like water. She had nothing left to lose, nothing left to fear. Nothing left to fear. Wish I could see my children one last time," she wrote. "But perhaps it is better that they remember me as I was, not as I am tonight." She paused, feeling her heart twist. She closed her eyes and imagined them. Her daughter's solemn gaze, her son's innocent smile. She whispered their names into the darkness, letting the sound break her in a way she had not allowed before. A tear slid down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. She wrote her last words to her husband, words she had never spoken aloud. "Louis, forgive me for every moment I failed you. Forgive me for the weight you bore alone. I walk toward you now, not as your queen, but as your wife." The candle flickered wildly, struggling against the draft, seeping under the door. She brought the diary closer, warming her trembling hands above the flame. "I feel the walls breathing with me," she wrote, "as if even this prison knows my time has come." Outside her cell, she heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate. They passed without stopping. She exhaled, unsure if it was relief or disappointment. "I thought they had come for me," she wrote. Perhaps it is mercy that they did not." The candle burned lower and lower until only a small ring of light remained. She hurried to fill the last page, her thoughts racing ahead of the ink. She wrote about fear, not of death, but of vanishing, of becoming a story told by those who never knew her, twisted into myth or monster stripped of humanity. "All I ask of history," she wrote, "is that it remembers me as a woman." Her breath caught. The candle sputtered, gasped, and died. For the first time since her imprisonment, she was left in total darkness. She closed her diary gently, feeling the rough cover beneath her palm. She held it to her chest, and in that darkness, she whispered her final prayer, not to be saved, but to be understood. Dawn arrived, like a cold blade. The guards came before the sun fully rose. She heard their boots echo down the corridor, heard the jangle of keys, the whispers that trailed behind them. When they stopped at her cell, she did not flinch. They opened the door. The stale morning air rushed in. "It is time," one guard said. "It is time," one guard said. Marie nodded. She placed the diary beneath her straw mattress, the only place she could hide it. She hoped, perhaps foolishly, that someone kind would one day find it, someone who might read her words not with hatred but with compassion. She stood slowly. Her legs trembled, but she steadied herself. They cut her hair earlier. Now her head felt strangely light, exposed. She smoothed the front of her worn dress with shaking hands. She walked out of the cell. The corridor stretched endlessly, lit by torches that felt more like funeral candles than sources of light. Prisoners watched her pass, not with malice, but with hollow curiosity. They knew what awaited her. Outside, the air was cold enough to sting her skin. The sky was pale, streaked with faint hints of dawn. The cart waited. She climbed onto it without help. As the cart rolled through the streets of Paris, the crowd gathered. Thousands of faces, some shouting, some jeering, some silent. Their eyes pierced through her like knives. Yet she felt curiously detached, as if watching her own procession from afar. She did not bow her head. She looked at the crowd with a calm so profound it unsettled even those who came to mock her. At the scaffold, she climbed the steps carefully, each footstep echoing like a heartbeat. Her executioner adjusted the blade. She turned slightly and accidentally stepped on his foot. "Pardon me," she said softly. Her final words. Not a speech, not a plea, just an apology. Dignity until the end. She positioned herself beneath the blade, her breath steady. The world felt distant, blurred, softened by the knowledge that her suffering was finally over. A moment of silence hung in the air. Then the blade fell. Her diary remained hidden beneath the straw in her cell. Pages filled with fear, regret, love, and truth. A queen's final attempt to be seen as a woman. No one knew if she intended anyone to ever find it. But the words she left behind carried the weight of everything she could not say aloud. Her final entry, written in trembling ink, was simple. "My story ends tomorrow, but perhaps my truth begins."